Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. Joining me this evening is our regular Foreign Affairs panel, Green Senator Lee Rhiannon and Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg. There are some domestic issues to talk about as well, especially the shifting ground of the debate over media. First, Lee and Josh, welcome to you both. We might start with media reform. Bob Katter's put up a proposal for a panel to choose a committee to protect media diversity, which the Greens are looking at. He wants that instead of the government's proposals. Andrew Wilkie, though, wants none of it.
They needed to be very carefully considered and the bills very carefully crafted. But what we've had instead is a very rushed process. I'd go so far as to say it's been shambolic. You've only had to be in the galleries and to see all the carry-on to know that it has been very, very rushed. And it's not the way to approach very important reform and important public policy.
Lee, there have been a lot of discussions today involving your party and the independents. Can you say with any certainty yet whether you think these bills will get through the House of Representatives in some form?
We certainly hope they do. We need to have these bills passed, and we do think they needed to be improved. The Greens have worked for media reform for a long time. Our concern certainly has been the delay that the government put on bringing this before Parliament. Right now, it's certainly with the independents, and we are not fully sure what they'll do, but certainly with Mr Andrew Wilkie, I think it's very important that he doesn't bend over to bullying. He comes from a town that's dominated by News Limited in Hobart, and he needs to stand up to Mr Murdoch on this one.
But he says that he wants media reform. He just doesn't believe this is the right way to achieve it, given that the government's given the Parliament so little time to talk about it. Doesn't he have a valid point of view to have a look at a broader time and have a look at, say, beefing up the Competition and Consumer Commission?
Well, look, we certainly would have liked more time to look at it, but in Parliament you've got to get on and do the job, and that's what we're doing right now, and Mr Wilkie can certainly do that. When it comes to the reforms, I mean, we've made some compromises, but that issue of protecting regional outlets and media diversity, we've been able to win some changes there, and I think it's time Mr Wilkie really came on board with this.
Josh, the Coalition's had a lot to say about protecting media freedoms, about not having a government-appointed overseer of the media. But what's your view about media diversity? Because Bob Katter's proposal in particular is very squarely aimed at protecting media diversity.
I think there's a lot of media diversity out there in terms of not just the print and the broadcasters and also radio.
I'll just have to interrupt you, as happens occasionally with this program. Lee, the Senate bells are ringing, so we'll have to send you off.
Okay.
Unplug your microphone and go to the Senate
to
vote.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Lee.
It's not unusual. But Josh, as I was saying, media diversity, how critical is that, and does it need to be looked at?
No, I think we do have a lot of diversity out there in the media. We've got the print, we've got the broadcasters, we've got radio, and at the end of the day, there are new forms of media evolving all the time, and whether it's blogs and the use of the internet, and you've got the situation, for example, established journalists with the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age recently going to the Guardian, who have set on an online version here in Australia. So I think we've got diversity, but at the end of the day, Lyndall, these policy reforms, or these reforms the government's put forward, have been both flawed policy and a flawed process. I mean, the Parliament's been presented with these reforms by Stephen Conroy with just a few days to look at it, when the government's been sitting on its hands for nearly 2 years.
Well, I'll just stay with the issue of media diversity, because that argument comes up a lot, that there are lots of other things. There are lots of blogs, there are online sites, there are niche community stations, but in terms of the mass media, in terms of the media that gets to substantial numbers of the Australian population, isn't it fair to say that ownership, particularly because of the troubles that both newspapers and television have been in, ownership is being squeezed? There are fewer owners than there were 20 years ago.
Well, look, the thing is we do have diversity in the broadcasters. In the print media, it's a bit more concentrated, which then begs the question, why is the government now doing this? And I think it's a political vendetta. I think they're going after News Limited. I think these bills are squarely focused at News Limited and a retribution for what the government perceives as being unfair coverage or biased coverage, which it hasn't been. It's been straight up and down from News Limited. Just it's not to the government's liking.
Is there a case, though, to have a public interest test, whether it's applied by some new government advocate or applied by the ACCC, to look at any mergers and acquisitions that take place in the mass media?
Well, somebody whose view I would respect here would be Graham Samuel, as a former head of the ACCC, and he said that the public interest test would very quickly become a political test, and the fact is we've already got systems in place to adjudicate whether a merger will enhance competition or not, and we don't need this new layer of bureaucracy. So, Graham Samuel's made it very clear that when you create a political czar that's appointed by the politicians, answerable to the politicians with no other formal appeal mechanisms.
But what about the ACCC? Nobody's suggested that the head of the ACCC is open to political influence, have they?
No, but what we're doing is creating a new layer, aren't we?
But couldn't you create a public interest test for the ACCC to administer?
We think the system works pretty well as it does, Lyndall. I mean, the point is, as Graham Samuel himself has said, the government's new proposal to create a public interest media advocate would create, indeed, a political test, and that's not what's called for.
We might move on to some foreign affairs issues. It's the 10th anniversary of the US-led invasion into Iraq. It coincided with a series of bombings in the capital. There are some people who say the US should never have gone into Iraq, and what it's left in its wake is an unstable country. Others who say, in the end, the Saddam Hussein regime was got rid of, and while it's an imperfect democracy, the Iraqi people have been able to vote. What's your view?
Well, there's no doubt there were some mistakes made after the invasion. I mean, the way the Ba'ath Party and the way the Iraqi military were dismantled effectively created, a great sea of resentment, and those people ended up working and fighting against the Americans and the international coalition.
So that was the policy of what's called de-Baathification.
Correct, and there were some mistakes there, Lyndall, no doubt about that. More troops could have been used at the beginning, and the fact that 4,500 Americans lost their lives is also a great tragedy, but so many innocent Iraqis also lost their life. But without trying to rewrite history, and Peter Cosgrove has made this point recently, I mean, what we knew back then was that everyone thought that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Even Kevin Rudd said it was a matter of empirical fact. And Saddam Hussein had been in breach of UN Security Council resolutions. He wasn't complying with the weapons inspectors. We know that he had previously used weapons of mass destruction against the Kurds and against his own people. And so
it's the case, though, that none were found.
Correct, and we'll never know where were they hidden. Did they make its way to another country in the chaos that followed an invasion? But at the end of the day, he was a dictator of the worst kind. He was a sponsor of global terrorism. He'd used weapons of mass destruction, and he was a threat to international security. So I'm very happy to see the back of Saddam Hussein.
What are the lessons that should be learnt from the way the invasion was run and what happened afterwards? And do you think those lessons are being learned?
Well, I think around counterinsurgency, General Petraeus and others have done a lot of work in this area, both in Afghanistan and people have done it in Iraq. So I think there's some really important lessons there, Lyndall, about how to deal with those domestic threats. And the other big, concern when you go into a country like Iraq is that schism between Shiites and Sunnis. So effectively they can fight a civil war, which it got to that situation in Iraq, and that's something that needs to be borne in mind when you're fighting a conflict in these countries.
When you look at the war in Iraq, do you think Australia, the Howard government, jumped into it a bit early, and did it in effect extend the war that was running in Afghanistan?
No, I don't think that the Howard government moved in preemptively. I mean, John Howard has said publicly the reasons why we're there were multi-faceted. I mean, essentially we are an alliance partner of the United States, and that's very important to Australia's security, and we were there alongside the United States, and proudly so. But also Saddam Hussein had proved to be a threat to international security, so Australia had a vested interest there. I'm very proud of the role that Australia's special servicemen and women, the fact that our aircraft were there, the fact that we had naval forces there as well. We played an important role.
We might just move on. While the parliamentary debate about Australia's economic circumstances continued, the economic woes of Europe continued to create nerves around the world. Both issues were on show in Parliament today.
In what year will Labor's run of deficits finally end, given that the global financial crisis actually ended almost 4 years ago?
The global financial crisis is apparently yesterday's news. Wouldn't it be news to the people of Cyprus? Wouldn't it be news to the millions and millions of people unemployed in Europe? We will continue our strategy of jobs and growth and prudent budget management.
Now, we've seen, Josh, in the last day or so, quite a great deal of nervousness in Cyprus about a condition of an international bailout, that there be a tax on bank deposits. Nobody in the Cyprus Parliament voted for it. It's created nervousness. It's reported in other countries in Europe about the prospects of bank deposit taxes there. The position of Europe is far different to the position of Australia, isn't it? And there is still the prospect of some bad winds blowing from Europe to affect the Australian economy.
Absolutely right. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you just said. I mean, at the end of the day, Tony Abbott was making exactly the right point, which is the global financial crisis, as we know it, is over. But that's not to say there are not economic troubles in Europe and the United States and elsewhere which can have a negative impact on Australia. But if there is one lesson out of Europe, it's, live within your means. I mean, those countries of Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland and elsewhere have huge bureaucracies, huge pension payments, and, effectively a number of their industries have been inefficient. And, at the end of the day, that's a message for Australia.
But isn't it the case that those huge bureaucracies and huge government payments to people, that Australia over the last 20 years has pared back some of that and really isn't comparable? Australia over the long run of the last 20 years or so has got its house in order in terms of those things.
Well, Lyndall, I think you were pointing to the record of the Howard government when we paid back...
But the record of the Hawke and Keating and Howard governments and this government, that you're not seeing the extent of the sorts of things that happened, particularly in Greece. They don't happen in Australia.
Well, the fact is the Hawke and Keating governments were reforming governments, and we've got to give some credit where credit's due. And John Howard paid back what was $96 billion of debt which he inherited. But since that time, in the Rudd and the Gillard governments, we have seen debt escalate. And that's a big lesson out of Europe. Do not let debt get out of control, because those interest bills will actually really hurt future generations. So I do think there is some relevance there.
If you win the election in September, though, you will still have to deal with the sort of headwinds we're seeing coming from Europe, won't you? And the effect they might have on revenue.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great things for Australia has been the economic boom out of China and the demand for the resources, which doesn't have the same impact in Europe, of course, because they're not producing iron ore and coal like Australia. So we have been beneficiaries, and we're saying do not squander those opportunities with an inefficient system. But the lesson out of Cyprus is very serious, and, it's a sign of maybe things to come.
Josh Frydenberg, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Lyndall. Pleasure to be here.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Capitol Hill will be back tomorrow. Until then, good night.